Your study findings show that the TPLF was forcibly just recruiting child soldiers, just in exchange of, humanitarian aid to parents. And your study also just showed very similar things. Still now, the TPL reports show that the TPLF has continued forced conscription of child soldiers, and even it looted the warehouse in Megale, WFP's warehouse in Megale, and this group is still just diverting aid to its combatants. But the international community has still remained silent on that. What is the best thing to alarm the international community on such issues?
It's important to note that international law requires that humanitarian aid get delivered, and space and access is given to the delivery of humanitarian aid under any circumstances. But this is very difficult when an insurgency group is in control of the governance structure of an area where humanitarian aid is being handed over to. So you're effectively handing humanitarian aid to insurgency leaders. And this is why I've said on several other interviews that insurgency goals are very incompatible with humanitarianism. And I stand by that point and fully believe in it. And this is why humanitarianism can easily become compromised under these circumstances. And for those who studied Ethiopia and the insurgency back in the 1980s, which was led, interestingly, by many of the same personalities that have led this insurgency regime, or this insurgency effort, I should say, they will know that many similar tactics were used then as being used now. And humanitarianism was being completely compromised by these insurgency tactics. This is why we see aid being rediverted to and a priority given for that aid to the combatants and the combative force. Also, the governance structure that humanitarian partners have been left with in the region continues to prioritize aid and sustenance towards those fronting the fight for them. I think it's important to note that a number of independent reports have corroborated the fact that some unconstitutional and criminalized laws have been passed by the TPLF since they returned from the Tembian region in June 2021 after the government declaration of the unilateral ceasefire. Space was given for them to come back to Mekelle. They adopted what I was told and what I understood to be 4 unconstitutional and criminal laws that criminalized anyone who had cooperated, who had communicated with, who had supported in any way the interim government. So there were lists, arrest lists that were pursued. Families were also pursued who refused to hand conscripts over under a TPLF-led forced conscription program, which required 1 fighter per family to be handed over, or else that family would be denied any aid, and the family members would all be arrested and imprisoned as well. So under these kind of unconstitutional laws, humanitarianism that should prioritize the population in a very equitable, distributive manner will be compromised for sure. Life will be made very difficult for those humanitarian partners that are required to operate under such an authoritarian regime and unconstitutional policies. The issue about the child soldiers, I mean, you know, if you follow me on Twitter, the silence of the international community on child soldiers deeply concerns me. And I've seen over the years in other countries that I've worked in, like South Sudan and Nigeria, northern Nigeria, rights groups really speaking out quite quickly about the issue of child soldiers. In Uganda, the search for the Lord's Resistance Army leaders that were forcibly conscripting child soldiers became a foreign policy priority for the United States. And indeed, special forces were sent on the ground to help bolster the capacity of the Ugandan Defense Force, the Ugandan People's Defense Force, to hunt down these non-state armed group actors who were forcibly conscripting underage youth. You know, and the fact that elements of the international media and certain international leaders popularized the recruitment of child soldiers as a noble thing was deeply disappointing and quite shocking in this day and age. This issue runs close to my heart, especially as I have godchildren of ethnic Tigrayan origin. I think there should be zero tolerance, absolutely, for this kind of activity. And based on the numbers that are being discussed on the ground, many children have already been lost in Tigray, Amhara, and Afar. And you know, I spoke at great lengths with underage forced recruits from Tigray who had surrendered themselves at the earliest opportunity to federal authorities and to members of the community in Amhara and Afar, where they had been forced into battle. And they spoke in a very heartbreaking way about many of their brothers and sisters who had perished in battle. Let's move to the issue of the stolen fuel. I mean, I think this was a real turning point for the conflict. It was the first time, in my opinion, that the US government had spoken out directly against the TPLF. And this speaking out really launched a wave of comments and statements made by international leaders, like the United Kingdom, condemning the theft of fuel and the ongoing incursions into Amhara and Afar. These comments have been tempered by also calls for the federal government to halt airstrikes and also for the Eritrean government to stay out of the conflict. But I think, you know, on that last issue, we need to see more evidence-based accounts of the exact role that Eritrean soldiers are playing at the moment, because that seems to be, in my view, an area that is gray and continues to lack evidence supporting and uncorroborated. You know, there are issues, we all know about the issues concerning the northern border between the region of Tigray and Eritrea. This has been a contested issue. There's a region around Badme that was handed over to Eritrea as a result of an arbitration commission that looked at this following the Ethiopian-Eritrean War in 2002. And but that land was never formally given back, and therefore it has remained contested. Now, is the issue around this land, or is the issue that Eritrean soldiers are coming further into Tigray? Many of us have tried to find out more details about these issues, but that space is being dominated by a narrative at the moment that remains unevidenced and uncorroborated. And you know, we see posts being made on social media that start with rumor has it, or unconfirmed but. And really, in my view, in academia, there is no space for these types of comments. Respected academics just don't speak in that language. And so we all have to behave responsibly around this kind of evidence or lack thereof. I guess the last thing that I would say is there's also, with all these statements that are implicating the TPLF, the federal government of Ethiopia, and the government of Eritrea, I think we just have to be careful that there's, to avoid this false sense of parity between a rebel-led insurgency force and a federal government. And I think this has always been the elephant in the room in this conflict in northern Ethiopia. And I think if we want to get that elephant out of the room and on the table transparently, we have to recognize that this conflict in northern Ethiopia is between a democratically elected government and an aggrieved, disposed lead party of a former coalition-based regime. And until this issue is firmly understood and the background and the circumstances of it is well understood and well informed, I do not believe that we can have a meaningful conversation on the conflict in northern Ethiopia. The continuation of fighting, in my view, is very unnecessary and avoidable. And I think the first thing that needs to happen is an official declaration and commitment to a ceasefire by both parties. Now, in my view, the Ethiopian government declared a unilateral ceasefire, then it declared a new indefinite humanitarian truce, but a legitimate democratically elected government has a commitment to its people to protect the safety and security of a country's borders, its population, and its sovereignty. So if a rebel force is attacking a country or terrorist acts are being committed against a country, no responsible government is going to sit by passively and watch this happen without protecting the people. So what is going to stop that is an official declaration by both sides and commitment to a ceasefire. This ceasefire has been one-sided since the word go. And the TPLF has to be held to not only declare a formal ceasefire, but also implement a formal ceasefire. The only actions that I noted were statements by the TPLF that they wanted to give peace a chance, and they withdrew from the 5 districts of Afar. But this is not the same as a formal declaration of a ceasefire and implementation of a ceasefire. So, it gave them leverage and agility to continue building a fighting force, to continue deploying aggressive activity and armed procurement activity towards border areas. And that will never provide the right incentives for the TPLF to cease fire and to silence the guns and the weapons. So I think that's the first thing that needs to happen. The second thing is that both parties need to be called back to the peace talk table. And if both parties are interested in peace in Ethiopia and have a commitment to the Ethiopian people, in my view, there is no reason why there is no incentive not to come to the peace talk table. I think all parties, including international partners, should stand behind the African Union-led process. I have been privileged to support AU-led peace processes in other parts of Africa. African leaders are very skilled at this type of dialogue and facilitating this dialogue. There is no reason why the AU should not lead on this. And I think if calls are, if the AU cannot lead on this, then that is very concerning for the African continent. And I don't believe that is the case. If those efforts are not being honored and supported to come to a peace talk table with the objective of peace in mind, then sanctions have to be levied against the party blocking those peace talks without hesitation. Sanctions have already been levied on the Ethiopian government and others threatened towards the Ethiopian government, but no sanctions or even a threat of sanction have been projected towards the other party of this conflict, the rebellious TPLF force and the leaders. And there are ways that you can sanction and threaten sanctions against the TPLF. These leaders have overseas assets, they have overseas bank accounts, and some sort of threat should be projected towards them, or else there is no incentive for peace. It's a blank check to continue with warfare and efforts to pursue economic objectives and power grab objectives. So I think the international community, if it really wants to end this fighting, it has to be serious about punitive measures towards those that are blocking peace. I think the language characterizing the conflict needs to be addressed. I think notions of siege, blockade, genocide, all of which empirical studies and reports have been debunked in the raw form of those words and what they mean, are very unhelpful going forward, particularly unhelpful to the Tigrayan population, which is being held hostage under these narratives. And in a sea of unevidenced, uncorroborated, published and posted disinformation and misleading narratives about this conflict, aided by some individuals who have never been to Ethiopia before, but who are consistently amplifying falsely informed messages, there has to be some sort of truth and reconciliation commission created to establish even a baseline truth that can enable people to move forward in the future, that can enable people to gain a sense of resolve, and for some social and historical injustices to be really properly dealt with. Peace is important for the much needed reform process as well. And war is stalling these reforms because Tigray is not represented in parliament at the moment. Tigrayan representation in parliament has been effectively boycotted by this war. And therefore, the reform process is being held hostage. There were very debilitating laws and legislation that existed under the former administration, and democratic pathways moving forward are not possible unless laws and legislation can be changed and reformed. And of course, the rest of Ethiopia does not want to take that reform process forward unless their Tigrayan brothers and sisters are part of that conversation. So we need peace to come for other reasons as well, wider reform processes that will help the country pursue the democratic pathway, which almost 80% of the voters that turned out for the election have decided on and made a commitment to.
Thank you very much again for giving us your precious time, Madam Professor.
Thank you so much.